this is part 2 of the What is Science, or an introduction to thinking like a scientist. So I just wanted to go through what we did last time, which was to talk about research questions, selection of a research question. So what's a good research question? What makes a very meaningful research question? And how do we go about coming up with research questions when we're out and about? So sometimes it happens that we notice something in real life. You notice something about somebody's behavior and you start to wonder, is that kind of a pattern for most people? Or is there a reason for that behavior? And then you come up with a research question. So we talked about that in part 1. And then we kind of talked about how do you go about refining that research question and making it meaningful and important, and that it'll kind of answer some important theoretical or practical questions for society. And so this time, what we're going to talk about is what you would then do after that research question. So what's the next step? How do you then go about selecting a way to answer that? So we talked about paradigms and how that might affect the way that you design your research studies. But in this one, we're going to talk about different types of research studies. So stay tuned for that. And just to kind of remind you of the next part in designing your research question is then how you're going to test it. Are you going to seek to describe the phenomena, or predict what's going to happen, or identify causal relationships? And all those are more quantitative types of research studies. So they, end up with some kind of numbers to test. Or whether you want to understand people's perspectives or experiences using their own words, rather than trying to categorize them using, research studies that have happened in the past. Mm-hmm. And those are more qualitative research studies. So they're more about the quality of the data, I guess, rather than the quantity of a number that you get. So I'm going to talk about quantitative first. So you could choose an observational correlational design for looking at description or prediction, an experimental design for answering any kind of causal research question, so whether one thing causes another. A single case design is very rare, but that's when you're seeking to understand and treat one individual. I have seen studies in my field like that, but they're very rare. Or a quasi-experimental design, which is for causal research questions where you don't have full control over what environment people are in.
Right.
So we'll go a little bit more into those to give an example. So giving a description, for example, researchers define, classify, catalog, or categorize events and relationships to describe mental processes and behavior. An example would be psychologists describing symptoms of helplessness and depression. And the next one would be prediction, where you try to identify correlations or how variables might co-vary with each other. So as one goes up, the other one goes down, or as one goes up, the other one goes up, but all those kinds of things. So how they're able to predict mental processes and behavior. So for example, as level of depression increases, individuals exhibit more symptoms of helplessness. And that's just kind of establish whether helplessness is related to depression. Mm-hmm. And then explanation, researchers understand a phenomenon when they can identify the cause. So participants exposed to unsolvable problems become more pessimistic and less willing to do new tasks, so become more helpless than participants who are asked to do solvable problems. So that would be an experimental design, because they're asked to do something different and you're controlling what they're being asked to do. And then application. So psychologists apply their knowledge to change people's lives for the better. So maybe treatment that encourages depressed individuals to attempt tasks that can be mastered or easily achieved, hopefully would decrease those feelings of helplessness and pessimism. So that would be the treatment application of this research.
Right. So maybe a good thing to point out is for this description prediction, when you do these studies, you're not changing anything about the participants. You're just seeing what's there.
Yeah.
Right. And in description, you're just describing what's there. In prediction, you're just figuring out what things you're seeing go with what other things. Whereas an experiment, you're actually manipulating something.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
that's an important distinction.
Yeah. With description and prediction, you're kind of like, these are naturally occurring things.
Yeah, you'll sometimes...
And you're observing them and noting them in some way.
Yeah, you'll sometimes hear people use the term natural experiment, which means that we're doing a correlational study, but we just can't admit it to ourselves.
Yeah. So these are kind of some of the research studies that I've done. I've done virtual reality, having kids do a roller coaster and testing their heart rate, and eye tracking, looking at where people look on a face to determine if they're happy or sad. What parts of the face do they look at to determine happy, sad, scared? Some observational studies where babies are playing with their mums, and we're looking at what kind of language the mums are using when they talk to their kids. And also looking at aggression with a computer task. So I call it aggression, but you're taking points away from your opponent in response to them taking points away from you. So we'll kind of talk about operationalization and how well that's done, but that just gives you some ideas. So yes, operationalization, once you have a research topic and a research question, will you be able to answer it with a certain kind of research design, and how? So for example, with mine looking at aggression, I looked at how many points they took away from their opponent. So I then asked them to say how often they are aggressive. So again, I can get a number. And then I had them play that game, and I looked at how many points they took away from their opponent. So again, I had a number out of that. And then I could look at the correlation between those two. And actually, as the more they said that they are an aggressive person, the more points they took away from their opponent on this game that I observed in the moment. Mm-hmm. So they're kind of giving, this is how I am in real life, on an everyday basis. And then I found that in a game when they were sat there. Mm-hmm. So then you have to think about the strengths and weaknesses of the various options, right? So in my study, for example, they're giving a self-report about their aggressiveness. And it could be that someone who's really aggressive will lie. Mm-hmm. Or it could be that a person who's really not aggressive is like, oh yeah, I totally stand up for myself, and think of themselves as a more mm-hmm. dominant kind of person. And so, yes, there's, it could be that they lie. The game that I gave is points taking away from the opponent, the same thing as like punching people, or, people have studied aggression, looking at how much hot sauce you give to your opponent. Is that aggression? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Is it causing harm? So again, it's about understanding what we mean by these terms.
Yeah. So this is the part where like you leap from the general to the specific. Mm-mm. Right?
Yeah. So the general concept of aggression, how do you then
what do I actually
specify it? Yeah.
Yeah. And if you when you design a study, you find out that you have a million little things to do along these lines. There are just so many options.
Yeah, and I think when I was saying about like non-scientific, mm-hmm. average human on the street, if you ask them like, do you think like, I don't know, Boris Johnson or Trump is like an aggressive person? Like, I think we don't operationalize our terms to each other, right? So you can ask somebody on the street, like, do you think intelligence is inborn or like learned?
I think intelligence is an invalid concept, but go on.
But like an average person would probably do like a whole mental gymnastics with you and go like, well, I think it's, whatever. And they would make a huge claim about it. And then when you ask them like, well, what do you mean by intelligence? They wouldn't, different people would have completely different definitions about what they mean. Or maybe they'd even
maybe
be
no
able...
definition.
And no definition. They're just like, I know what it is when I see it.
Yeah. Exactly.
So I think, it's useful for scientists to have a good definition that's really specific and to agree that those are the concepts.
That's the point here, right? Is we already do plenty of like skating along on kind of half-formed definitions and things, because that's how you get through life. That's how I actually, am standing here and, dealing with everything occurring around me, because you don't have time to apply the scientific method to everything. But when we are taking the time to breathe and do this, it's really important to make sure we actually know what it is we're talking about and what that means in practice in the study.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So, yeah, you can have a go at what you would do if you wanted to study the effects of caffeine on energy level. How could you do that as a correlational study? How could you do that with an experiment with a manipulated independent variable? So that's, where you take caffeine and maybe give some people a lot of caffeine and give some people no caffeine, but like a drink that's decaffeinated, just so that you keep it the same. How could you do this with an experiment with a measured, not manipulated caffeine variable? So you could ask people how much they drank that day and then ask them to perform some task or any kind of thing like that. Or how could you do it qualitatively? So maybe asking people about how they think caffeine affects them and how they are when they don't have caffeine, maybe when they've been ill and they've had to get off tea and coffee, and how that has been for them. What's their, life experience of having done that? So yeah, there's a lot of, once you have a research question, I guess the point of this is that there's so many different ways that you can then design a study to answer that question. And then after you design the study and perform the study, you're then analyzing the data. So again, you were talking about those abstractions and then specifications and then going back to the broad generalizations. So most psychologists try to establish broad generalizations and general laws that apply to a diverse population. So that's what you're hoping to do, broaden out from that one study. And so to accomplish this, psychology studies often involve large numbers of participants. You want to be able to abstract to the general population. So you have to have enough participants that it's going to be relevant to a large population. And a lot of times we describe the average or typical performance of the group that we're interested in. So their average level of aggression or their average level of energy. And this average may or may not describe the performance of any one person in that group.
Right, yeah.
So this is called a nomothetic approach. And I saw in a textbook, they were looking at, is it not here? They were looking at averages across different people in different countries and how much, how fast they walk and things like that. But we'll show you that in a minute. But that's contrasted with the idiographic approach, which pertains to individuals rather than groups. So case studies, some qualitative work. We'll have, one of my trainees is doing a study with 6 people to do a qualitative study, which involves, at least an hour-long interview with them to understand their experience. So researchers who use an idiographic approach recognize that people behave in ways that conform to general laws, so they don't deny that there are generalizable principles and processes that humans do, but they want to understand the uniqueness of individuals as well. So the two complement each other.
Yeah.
You have, quantitative or, more nomothetic work, and then you have idiographic work to complement that and to be able to show a nuanced behavior.
Yeah, so a good monothetic research kind of catches the most people, and good idiographic researcher makes sure no one falls through the cracks.
Yeah, exactly. So this was what I was talking about, to give an example. So this is looking at walking speed in different countries, postal clerks' speed in processing their daily work, and bank clocks. And looking at how accurate and the speed of performing tasks. And you can see that some places had a more kind of a greater speed of movement and greater accuracy. And those were places like the United States and Japan, which are more fast-paced. So they talk. The way that they operationalized, or the way that they then used a more generalized or abstract concept, was to talk about the pace of life in a country.
Right.
So that's
right.
what they ended up calling this, is that Japan and the United States have a greater pace of life
Yeah.
in a country. So again, you can argue whether, walking speed, accuracy of bank clocks, and postal clerks' processing speed of their daily tasks is a pace of life for a whole country. But, the researchers didn't say any one person in the United States or Japan is going to be, have a high pace of life. But it describes an average. And then also you'd have to think about, are these things representative of a pace of life? Or what would you think is indicative of pace of life?
Well, yeah, I feel like here also we should have a quick call back to historical context, right?
Yeah,
probably.
Exactly.
This was published in 1990 when like the bank having an accurate clock was important.
Yeah.
Nowadays, it'd be shocking if any institution didn't have an accurate timepiece anymore, right?
Yeah. Exactly. But yeah, I think so. This is the kind of thing that would be more mnemotechnic, right?